guys. Tonight, we will slip through the velvet curtains of history, stepping into a world where chains. You're standing in a cold medieval hall, torchlight flickering on stone walls, and serpent-like whispers curling through the corridors. At the center of it all, a young girl named Isabella, a queen married off to a foreign kingdom, only to discover that her true enemies weren't warriors, but monsters in human form. This isn't a fairy tale. And if you think this is a gentle bedtime story, well, you might not survive till the end. So before you lie back and relax, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly feel what we're doing here is worth it. And don't be shy, drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing where tonight's journey begins across the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in a far-off year 1308. You're just 13 years old. You've just left the magnificent capital of Paris, shipped off like a high-end commodity, crossing the sea to a foreign land colder, harsher, and absolutely unfriendly. You are Isabella, beloved daughter of King Philip IV of France. Here's Gaveston, a young nobleman from Gascony. But don't be fooled by the title noble. Gav's soulmate, the one Edward trusts so much that he showers him with lands. Ears of the superstitious, the narrow-minded, and the men who feared intelligent women they turned into fire. People began to say Isabella was a witch, that she knew things without. Spencer made the biggest mistake of his life. He underestimated Isabella. While the stories of the beastly queen spread like wildfire, Isabella didn't cry, didn't flee, didn't beg for mercy. She did what very few, especially women of that era, dared to do. She remembered. Quietly, she kept a list who was spreading the rumors, who benefited from smearing her, and who would eventually pay. It wasn't a war of swords and spears, but of wit, strategy, and waiting for the right moment. And then, that moment came, cloaked in the guise of a so-called war. In 1324, tensions between England and France flared into open conflict. The skirmish, later known as the War of Saint Sardos, erupted over disputed lands in Gascony French territory under English control. And as Edward II and Hugh Despencer scrambled for a solution, they made what they thought was a clever move, but turned out to be a fatal mistake. They sent Isabella to France as royal envoy to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV of France. Despencer believed exiling Isabella served two purposes: removing an enemy from court and giving her the blame should diplomacy fail. But he forgot one thing: Isabella was no pawn, she was a player. In March 1325, Isabella returned to Paris, but this time, she was no longer the lost 13-year-old girl of years past. She was a woman who had been smeared, who had survived the daggers behind ceremonial smiles. And now, she returned in control of the game. And she made a bold move. Isabella convinced Charles IV to summon her son, Edward III, then just 12 to France to perform feudal homage in his father's name. According to feudal custom, this made perfect sense. Edward II couldn't object. So in September, the young prince was brought to Paris. But Isabella didn't just want to visit her son. She wanted to keep him close, in her arms, out of Despencer's reach. And from that moment on, Isabella held the most powerful weapon, the heir to the English throne. Weeks later, Edward II began to realize the problem. He sent letter after letter demanding his wife return to England. Threats, pleas, begging. But Isabella remained unmoved. She sent back only one sentence full of meaning and cold as steel: "I will not return while the wolf is still in the fold." Yes, the wolf. A sharp, mocking title for Hugh Despencer, the man who once turned her into the she-wolf of debauchery in the public eye. Now, the image returned to its source. And this time, it was no longer an insult. It was a declaration of war. From that point, the story began to shift. If Isabella was a wolf, perhaps it was because she had been hunted too long. If she had become dangerous, perhaps it was because she had been betrayed too often. The same rumors that once sought to destroy her now only added power to a new image. Isabella, the exiled mother. The resilient woman, the wronged queen rising to reclaim what was hers. And then fate delivered the perfect ally, Roger Mortimer, an English nobleman once exiled for defying Despenser, now living in France. Mortimer wasn't just a seasoned warrior, he was a man who bore the same scars as Isabella. Humiliation, loss, and vengeance. They met in Paris, and as if it had been ordained by God, they became lovers. No secrecy, no pretense, no apologies. The queen, who had once been accused of relations with animals, now openly having an affair with her husband's political enemy. A massive shock to society at the time, but that very shock became a brilliant psychological move, because the public no longer needed to believe in the outlandish tales. They didn't need to think she was sleeping with dogs or casting spells with demons. They only needed one real scandal clear. Simple and true. Isabella was sleeping with Mortimer. That was enough. Obvious, tangible, and very real. And suddenly, the old rumors began to sound ridiculous. And then, in the winter of 1325, love turned into conspiracy. Isabella and Mortimer began planning the unthinkable, an invasion of England. Not a prince, not a foreign empire, but a queen herself, a wife, a mother, and a woman once exiled from her kingdom would return with an army, not just to reclaim the throne for her son, but to take revenge. Revenge on the man who turned her into a monster. Revenge on the man who stole her honor. Revenge on the man who believed women didn't know how to play the game. September 1326. Sea winds whipped the coast of Suffolk. On the gray horizon, the sails of a small fleet emerged, but this was no grand invasion force with drums and fanfare. No trumpets. No pomp. Just a cast-off queen. A few hundred Flemish mercenaries. A handful of disillusioned English nobles. And a 13-year-old boy, the future king of England. When Isabella stepped onto English soil, no one resisted. Not a single arrow was fired. Not a single oath was sworn to protect the king. Instead, people quietly joined her modest army, not just desperate peasants, but barons and powerful noblesmen who had long grown tired of Edward II and loathed Hugh Despenser. One of the most notable among them was Henry of Lancaster, the king's own cousin. When he knelt before Isabella instead of the king, England understood the balance of power had just shifted. This was no longer a rebellion. This was a coup. Isabella didn't conquer, she won over. Within weeks, what had seemed like a reckless gamble became a victorious march. From small towns to great cities, the people welcomed Isabella as a heroine, and it's not hard to see why. For years, they had known her only through eerie rumors and grotesque images spread by the church, the court, and those in power. But now they saw her with their own eyes, elegant, intelligent, composed, and ruthlessly practical. The contrast between reality and the old rumors was too stark, and the rumors began to dissolve. Meanwhile, Edward II, the man meant to defend the throne, panicked. Instead of organizing a defense, he and Hugh Despenser fled west, hoping to escape to Wales, where a few loyal allies still remained. But their flight only confirmed what Isabella had so skillfully planted in the public mind, that King Edward was a weak man, ruled by a parasite. In London, an uprising exploded. The people were enraged. They destroyed the homes of Despenser's allies, freed political prisoners, and turned the capital into a chaotic stage of rebellion against the central regime. When Isabella entered London in early October, the streets were packed, not with jeers but with applause. They no longer saw her as a witch or a monster, but as the savior of the kingdom. But Isabella knew as long as Edward and Despenser were alive, her victory would remain incomplete. So she issued a warrant. The reward £1, 000 for the king, £500 for Hugh Despenser, a sum worth millions today. A manhunt was officially underway, and in an age where loyalty shifted like the wind, the price was too tempting to resist. Despenser, the elder, was caught first, and he wasn't lucky. The furious crowd demanded blood. He was hanged to death, neither noble nor quiet. But Isabella had a special gift reserved for her true enemy, Hugh Despenser, the younger. In October 1326, he was captured, and what followed was not an execution. It was a punishment, straight out of medieval hell. He was hanged, but not to die. Brought down alive, castrated, eviscerated, then quartered. His body parts were sent to different cities as a clear warning. This is the price you pay for dragging my honor through the mud. Isabella, once ridiculed as a lustful she-wolf, had now become the living terror of England. As for Edward II, he was captured in November, a broken man, shattered in both body and spirit. Brought before Isabella, the wife he had once scorned, once left to be humiliated. But Isabella didn't kill him. No, she didn't want blood on her hands, at least not in public. Instead, she orchestrated a masterclass in political theater, forcing Edward to abdicate. In January 1327, inside a grand hall, Edward II, dressed in black, as if attending a funeral, and he was his own, he formally renounced the crown, passing it to his son Edward III. Beside him stood Isabella, in royal regalia, chin lifted high, as if to declare, "I have rewritten history." And she truly had. From a woman scorned, mocked, treated as a joke, Isabella had risen, leading a coup not just through blood, but by controlling the narrative. She crushed rumor with reality. She wore the she-wolf mask to conceal real claws. And when the time came, she struck without hesitation. But there was still one final problem. Edward II was still alive. And as long as he lived, he remained a symbol for anyone who might wish to challenge the new regime. 9 months after his deposition, he died of illness in a remote prison in Berkeley. But no one believed that. Rumors rose again. It was said he was tortured with a red-hot iron rod inserted rectally to leave no visible marks. But to kill him from the inside, a death both punitive and symbolic, eerily mirroring the very rumors once spread about him. And if that rumor was true, it was the final move. Isabella had completed her revenge. After the shadowy death of Edward II, England entered a new era, one not ruled by a king, but by a queen and her lover. Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer were now the two most powerful names in the kingdom. Officially, the boy King Edward III, just 14, sat on the throne, but everyone knew real power lay in the hands of his mother, acting as queen regent, and the once exiled noble, now her lover, her co-conspirator, and nearly her uncrowned co-ruler. The two lived openly together at court, no longer secret, no longer shameful. Mortimer was named Earl of March, one of the highest honors of the realm. He was granted lands, wealth, privileges even more than what Hugh Despenser had enjoyed under Edward II. Nobles whispered that England had simply traded one tyrant for another. Except this time, the tyrant slept beside the queen regent, and Isabella, she walked with her head held high, her eyes gleaming with pride. Once trampled, ridiculed, called a monster, she was now the king's mother, the only woman truly in command of the realm. She hosted banquets, Isabella received foreign envoys, with a majesty few women of the era could even dream of. Rumors even said Isabella had begun to dress in masculine-style black cloaks, a sword at her hip, riding horses like a general. But power, as always, never comes without a price. Isabella and Mortimer began facing resistance from the very nobles who had once supported them. They had backed her coup, believing in a future of fairness and transparency. But now, they saw a harsh truth. Mortimer was growing greedy, authoritarian, and untouchable. He steadily took over the entire court, from finances to the military. Those who spoke out were dismissed or imprisoned. Mortimer dealt with political enemies no differently than Despenser once had. And Isabella remained silent. Some believed she was blinded by love. Others thought she knew and chose to be complicit. Whatever the reason, Isabella's image as England's savior began to fade. In the eyes of the people, she and Mortimer looked no different from a tyrannical couple, ruling with an iron fist wrapped in velvet. And then, as always, the inevitable arrived. In the shadows, someone was watching everything. Edward III, the young man who once silently watched his mother overthrow his father, who followed her as a symbol of legitimacy, had now grown up and began to see what could no longer be tolerated. Edward was not a forever naive child. He observed, he waited, and above all, he was not a fool. In 1330, as Edward III turned 18, he began planning to reclaim power. No fanfare, no bloody rebellion, just one precise strike and a silence that chilled the air. One night in October that year, while Mortimer and Isabella were staying at Nottingham Castle, Edward secretly ordered his loyal men to open a hidden gate and lead troops into the fortress. No one knew. No one suspected. Mortimer was arrested in Isabella's bedchamber. Isabella begged. She wept. She knelt before her son. "Spare him. I beg you." But Edward was unmoved. He was no longer the boy she once led by the hand. He was now king. And it was time to end the shadow of the past. Mortimer was put on trial. He didn't have much of a chance to defend himself. He was convicted of treason, of usurping royal authority, and was hanged at Tyburn. A simpler death than Despenser's, but just as cold and final. As for Isabella, she wasn't executed. Edward was still her son. He confined her to Castle Rising in Norfolk, a kind of luxurious house arrest, where she lived in comfort but could not leave. No one touched her, but no one listened to her anymore. And so, Isabella, who once stood at the peak of power, who once made all of England tremble, ended her life in silence. She lived more than 20 more years. No longer loved. No longer ruling. No longer praised. Some said she regretted it all, that in her final years, she would walk alone in the gardens, murmuring the names of her husband, her son, and the lost lover. Others claimed she felt no remorse at all, that she lived like a queen until the very end, head held high, quietly watching a world that had forgotten her. Whatever the truth, one thing is undeniable: Isabella was not a simple character. She wasn't fully a hero, nor entirely a villain. She was the embodiment of something dangerous, a woman with intelligence, who refused to play by the rules of men and dared to write her own. When Edward III finally ruled in his own name after Roger Mortimer's death and his mother's confinement, the kingdom seemed to exhale in relief. A new chapter was opened, and there was hope that the young king would be the fresh wind of change after years of political manipulation, driven by personal ambition. From the start, Edward III understood one thing: if he wanted to restore order, he had to start at the root: politics. The English court had rotted from within with factions, personal gain, and men who exploited royal favor to enrich themselves. Names like Despenser or Mortimer weren't just history, they were living warnings of what happens when power falls into hands without true legitimacy. So Edward's first move wasn't war. It wasn't foreign policy. It was to reform the royal government from the inside out. He began by streamlining the central administration. During Edward II's reign, powerful institutions like the Privy Council and royal offices had been twisted into tools for individuals, places where decisions weren't made in the interest of the realm, but based on who was liked and who was loathed. Edward III put an end to all that. He recruited new people, young, educated, and most importantly, unaffiliated with any faction. He gave opportunities to individuals from the rising urban middle class, a class gaining strength through the growth of commerce, instead of relying solely on the old nobility. This was a significant shift. Edward was one of the first monarchs to recognize the practical value of those without noble blood, but with administrative talent and loyalty to the crown, not to noble houses. Next, he restructured the chancery and the exchequer, the bodies responsible for records, taxes, and spending. Edward did not allow those who treated public funds as their own to continue unchecked as in the past. He ordered a full audit of royal expenditures and even personally reviewed major cases. This terrified the corrupt officials, and the surprising thing was, though barely over 18, Edward showed a political sharpness few had expected. But political reform couldn't stay within the palace walls. Edward knew what truly sustained England's strength: the trust of the nobility and parliament. Under Edward II, the relationship between the crown and parliament had collapsed, with laws ignored and nobles pushed out of power. Edward III did the opposite. He convened parliament frequently, more often than any previous king in the 14th century, not because he feared them, but because he understood if he wanted war, taxes, or reform, he needed consensus. By inviting Parliament into the decision-making process, Edward planted the seeds for a more balanced form of governance, where power was not concentrated entirely in the monarch, but gradually formed a cooperative relationship between royal authority and the people through their representatives. Another highlight of his political reform was the restoration of honor to loyal nobles who had been persecuted under Mortimer. Families who had been stripped of land, exiled, or imprisoned were reinstated, and many were called back to court to take up roles in the new government. This wasn't just justice, it was a politically wise move to rebuild trust. You must first restore fairness. In parallel, Edward paid close attention to the legal system, which had become weak and tangled over the years. He ordered a review of old statutes, removed outdated or absurd laws, and added new regulations suited to a changing world. During his reign, a crucial concept began to take clearer shape: the rule of law, where the law applied not just to commoners, but to the nobility and even the king himself. One of Edward III's longest-lasting political legacies was the evolution of the English Parliament into a two-chamber system, with the House of Commons representing landowners and the civil class, and the House of Lords representing the nobility and clergy. Under Edward, these two houses began to meet separately, a critical step in the formation of the modern parliamentary system. And finally, perhaps the most profound legacy of Edward's political reforms didn't lie in documents, but in restored trust. After years of chaos, the English people felt, for the first time in a long while, that they had a king who governed with reason, with fairness, and with vision. Edward III was not a perfect man. He would later lead England into bloody wars. But if one had to speak of the foundation of a mighty empire, it wasn't laid with swords, but with the reconstruction of political faith from the ashes. When Edward III first stepped into real power, England's economy was like a sick body struggling to breathe. Many rural areas were devastated from civil conflict and looting under Edward II. Merchants were drained by heavy taxation during Mortimer's rule. Craftsmen had lost faith in the law, while nobles focused only on hoarding land, collecting rent, and playing power games. To put it gently, the country was growing poor, not for lack of resources, but because faith in honest labor and free circulation had run dry. Edward III wasn't an economist in the modern sense, but he had the instincts of a king who understood this. If you want to fight wars, secure the throne, and be remembered in history, first, you must feed your people, let merchant trade freely, and keep the treasury full. And he did that in his own way. First, he focused on agriculture. Don't forget that in the 14th century, over 80% of England's population still lived off the land, but after years of internal conflict, many fields were abandoned, communities scattered, and crop yields had drastically declined. Edward issued policies to reduce land taxes for farmers who returned to cultivate, and ordered a nationwide investigation into land ownership, a move aimed at stopping nobles from illegally seizing land. Those who could prove lawful rights to farm were protected. Those who had exploited wartime chaos to claim land were forced to return it or pay fines. The result, a wave of farmers went back to their fields. They didn't become rich overnight, but they worked with peace of mind, knowing that for the first time in years, they were no longer pawns in anyone's political game. Second, he developed trade and encouraged exports. Edward III understood one simple yet profound truth. Wealth doesn't come from the treasury, it comes from exchange. Under his reign, one of the most impactful reforms was the support of the wool weaving industry, a product iconic to medieval England. Previously, England mostly exported raw wool to Flanders, now Belgium, where it was woven into cloth and sold with the profits going abroad. Edward saw the flaw. Why not weave in England? Why let others profit from English resources? So he invited skilled weavers from Flanders to England, offering them land, housing, and tax exemptions. Simultaneously, he issued decrees encouraging towns to open textile workshops, create fabric markets, and form craft guilds to protect workers' skills. From a country known only for raw wool, England quickly rose to become a textile center, and that gave the economy a powerful boost. Third, he reformed taxation and financial management. Nothing kills an economy faster than arbitrary taxes and corruption. After his political reforms, Edward III began overhauling the tax system not to raise revenue, but to increase fairness and transparency. He re-established tax records, catalogued lands, and clearly categorized each region's obligations. He also encouraged towns to manage their own local budgets as long as they fulfilled their national duties to the treasury. This created a more flexible financial system, more connected to the people, and less prone to corruption. Additionally, he allowed borrowing from international merchant banks, especially from Italy, and used trade taxes to repay the loans. This was a bold financial strategy for its time, turning England from a reluctant debtor into a trustworthy partner in the European financial network. Fourth, he promoted the construction of economic infrastructure. Many assumed the Middle Ages lacked roads or canals, but under Edward III, grain routes, artisan markets, seaports, and bridges were all improved. He decreed that local lords must allocate funds for repairing bridges, expanding market squares, and upgrading docks, not just for military needs, but to enable smoother trade. A clear road meant a clear market and a more unified kingdom. Lastly, he created a stable environment for long-term economic growth. You might not expect it, but it was during the early reign of Edward III that a new class began to emerge in England, the wealthy, educated merchants who would later form the backbone of the middle class. They were no longer people living off the favor of nobles, but individuals building wealth through legal trade, production, and investment. Edward not only protected them through law, but gave them a political voice in parliament sessions. When the working people felt their labor was respected, when merchants saw that investment was worthwhile. And when the government created a fair playing field, the economy didn't need to be stimulated. It would rise on its own, like a field after rain. And that's what Edward III accomplished. Before he led England into its long wars with France, he built a strong enough economic foundation to sustain an empire. A king who wove cloth for his people before drawing his sword for war. If there's anything people remember most about Edward III, it's not just that he was a reformer, not just that he was politically astute, but that he was a man who knew how to wield a sword and when, how, and why to use it. From a young age, Edward understood one vital truth: a kingdom is never respected if it only negotiates to keep the throne, the territory, and honor. One must have an army that is strong, disciplined, and terrifying. And he built it not by mimicking the tactics of the French emperors, but by inventing a uniquely English way of war. Reforming the army from feudal chaos to semi-professional force. Before Edward III, England's army still relied heavily on the feudal system the king called. Nobles brought a few hundred men. They came and went, often undisciplined, disorganized, and worst of all, not truly loyal. Edward couldn't allow that to continue, so he began building a semi-professional army where soldiers were no longer just farmers on seasonal duty, but trained, salaried, and disciplined like a war machine. He introduced the indenture system, a recruitment contract. Under this, a commander signed a contract with the king, promising a set number of troops, specific weapons, and length of service in exchange for wages, plunder, and honor. This model ensured structure, flexibility, and far more efficiency than the old system. Empowering archers and turning them into Europe's worst nightmare. If one image symbolizes Edward III's military legacy, it's that of the longbowmen. Edward saw clearly, while France placed its hopes in heavily armored knights on horseback. England could play a different game with agile peasants trained in longbows that could pierce armor from 200 meters away. Instead of investing in expensive plate armor and horses, Edward invested in archery skills. He passed laws requiring each village to train men in the longbow. Archery festivals were regularly held. Children learned from a young age. By 18, a healthy young man could hit a coin from across a football field. And when war came, these archers were living artillery batteries, spreading panic through the ranks of French cavalry. The royal guerrilla strategy: strike fast, loot hard, vanish. Edward knew he couldn't go toe-to-toe in pitched battles against France's massive army. Instead, he employed the chevauchée strategy. Let's call it royal guerrilla warfare. He divided his army into small, mobile units that moved quickly through the French countryside, burning granaries, stealing supplies, destroying roads, capturing castles, then retreating before the enemy could respond. Each campaign left France in economic agony more than military loss. This tactic didn't just drain French resources, it shattered public morale. The French people lost faith in their king, who couldn't protect them. It was a strike on both the wallet and the will of the enemy. Edward III wasn't merely a king of war. He was a king of strategy, in both state and battlefield. And that more than his crown, his victories, or his reforms is what defined the legacy he left behind. Organizing the army into a three-pronged model: light cavalry, archers, and heavy infantry. Edward III wasn't just skilled in training. He was a master of battlefield composition. In major battles, he consistently deployed his forces in three parts. Longbowmen at the front line, arranged in a crescent formation, unleashing volleys of arrows that shattered enemy formations before they could even engage. Heavy infantry in the center, mainly spearmen and swordsmen, held the line when enemy cavalry charged. Light cavalry served as a mobile force, striking flanks, pursuing retreating troops, or cutting off escape routes. This model proved devastatingly effective at Crécy in 1346, and later at Poitiers in 1356, where the English army, though outnumbered more than 2 to 1, secured resounding victories. Turning war into an industry. It may sound frightening, but it's true under Edward III. War became a structured economic enterprise. Soldiers were promised plunder. Nobles who fought could gain titles. Captured enemies were ransomed for gold. The entire process was managed like a military financial system. Edward even established a war office to record income and expenses, and to fairly divide spoils. This reduced chaotic looting and encouraged discipline and loyalty among commanders and troops alike. Crafting the image of the warrior king. And finally, Edward didn't sit in castles waiting for reports. He went to war himself, from Normandy to Calais, from Crécy to Poitiers. He stood alongside his men not just to command, but to inspire. A king who wasn't afraid of mud, cold, or danger. That image became England's banner, a monarch who not only governed but fought. And when soldiers saw their king on the front lines, they didn't fight just for gold, they fought out of loyalty. And that's how Edward III, the young man who reclaimed his throne from his mother and her lover, built one of the most formidable armies of medieval Europe, not through brute force, but through discipline, strategy, and spirit. When you walk across the English countryside in the mid-14th century, with the wind rustling through willows and the rich scent of ripening barley in the air, you could feel a quiet transformation, not loud, not flashy, but very real. England was changing under the reign of Edward III, following sweeping political reforms, comprehensive economic recovery, and glorious military victories. The people of England were finally granted something they had long been denied: hope. Villages began to revive. Thatched houses once burned in chaos were rebuilt with sturdy oak. Muddy roads were paved with stone. Markets bustled not just for eggs, chickens, and cloth, but as hubs of news from across Europe. Rural folk began hearing strange names like Flanders, Gaulish, and Poitiers, faraway places their own soldiers had visited, bringing back tales of conquest and pride. Prosperity often starts small. In Yorkshire, blacksmiths relit their forges for winter crafting plows, and also weapons. In Norwich, wool workshops ran day and night, dyeing cloth with indigo, lake cranes, and the bright crimson of southern cochineal. In London, a new class of merchants began to rise, not nobles, but educated, wealthy, and increasingly influential. This nascent middle-class merchants, artisans, factory owners, began to demand more protection of property, fair taxation, and representation in Parliament. Edward III, instead of suppressing them, listened. He gave them seats in the House of Commons, sowing the seeds of a representative political system. But not everything was sweetness and triumph. War also meant heavy taxation. To maintain a professional army and fund campaigns in France, Edward needed money. A lot of it: gold to pay soldiers, silver to build ships, and grain to feed the troops. So, despite the reforms, the burden still fell on the people, especially the peasants. They loaded grain onto carts, paid seasonal taxes, and sometimes even gave up their sons to the army. In some regions, discontent began to simmer, especially after drawn-out campaigns like those in Gascony and Calais. People whispered, "What's the point of victory if our sons don't return? Our fields lie fallow, and the Lord still counts his silver." And then, like a crack in a freshly plastered wall, the Black Death arrived. In 1348, The bubonic plague, the most horrific disease in human history, swept into England via merchant ships. Within 2 years, nearly half the population was dead. Streets were filled with corpses, homes abandoned, entire villages sealed off. Some were infected in the morning, and by evening collapsed in the town square. Edward III could not stop the plague. But what was astonishing was that he did not let the country collapse. On the contrary, he reallocated resources, lowered taxes in plague-hit areas, banned price gouging, and above all, restored trust. He sent letters to each region, issued edicts for the proper burial of the dead, organized national prayers, and urged priests not to abandon their flocks. While much of Europe descended into chaos, England retained its administrative structure, a strange triumph for a kingdom that had nearly torn itself apart in civil strife just decades earlier. And then, after the plague passed, something unexpected happened. The people grew stronger. With labor in short supply, nobles were forced to pay higher wages. Craftsmen gained bargaining power. Early labor laws were introduced, and those who once only bowed their heads now lifted them, not in revolt, but in demand for rights. This laid the groundwork for the deep social changes of the coming centuries. It was also during this time that culture blossomed. Schools were founded in major towns. The English language, once seen as the tongue of the commoners, began to return to court, replacing French. Poetry, legends of knights, goddesses of victory, and tales of loyalty spread from village to castle. People told each other stories of Edward's triumph at Poitiers, of the Black Prince Edward's son, heir to the throne, and a brilliant warrior, of battles where English longbowmen cut down French knights like scything hay. And they told these stories with pride, no longer with the fear and indifference of Edward II's reign, because now they knew they lived in a strong country, not because the king held a sword, but because the people had heart. When Edward III came into his full reign, Europe was far from the peaceful continent described in romantic histories. To the south, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon were still pushing back Muslim forces. To the east, the Holy Roman Empire was splintering in leadership conflicts. To the north, merchant alliances like the Hanseatic League were tightening their grip over maritime trade. And across the English Channel was France. France, not just a neighbor, but a lover, a rival, and a historical debt. The two kingdoms had been bound by royal marriages, land exchanges, and even shared noble blood. But that very closeness became the root of one of the longest conflicts in human history, the 100 Years' War. And it was Edward III who lit the spark. Why? Because he had one audacious claim: the throne of France. The story began when King Charles IV of France, Isabella's brother, died without a male heir. Under the Salic law, women could not inherit the French crown, nor could they pass succession rights to their sons. But Edward III, as the grandson of Charles IV, it declared that he had the right to the throne of France. Naturally, the French rejected this. They crowned a different relative, Philip VI, as king. So, in 1337, Edward III officially claimed the French crown, minting coins and stamping royal arms with the title of King of France. A simple declaration, but one that opened the door to a war that would rage for more than 100 years. From that point on, England's diplomacy with the rest of Europe became a complex chessboard. With France, Edward didn't rely solely on sword and shield. He wielded political alliances, trade leverage, and royal marriages. He signed treaties with duchies in northern France, like Brittany and Aquitaine regions, that constantly sought to free themselves from the French crown. He promised military support in exchange for loyalty. He also capitalized on the power of the Low Countries, especially Flanders, modern-day Belgium, whose textile industry heavily depended on English wool. Edward used wool as a diplomatic bargaining chip, threatening to cut off supply unless the Flemish cities supported his claim. At the same time, he sent envoys to Germany, Italy, and even to the papacy, seeking support for his bid for the French throne. With Scotland, the situation was no less tangled. This northern neighbor had always been a persistent threat to England. Since the days of Edward III's grandfather, invasions and rebellions had left scars that refused to heal. During Edward III's reign, Scotland sided with France under the Auld Alliance, a traditional pact to curb England's power. Edward responded with force. He launched a military campaign into southern Scotland, defeated David II, son of Robert the Bruce, and even captured him at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. David II was held prisoner in England for nearly 11 years, and was only released after Scotland paid a massive ransom, a move that was both symbolic and financially strategic, helping Edward fund parts of his war with maritime powers like Castile and the Italian states. Edward was more diplomatic. He understood without controlling sea routes, any land war would ultimately fail. So he signed trade and non-aggression treaties with Portugal, negotiated with port cities like Genoa and Venice to hire warships, mercenaries, and secure loans. In a clever political maneuver, he even married off his daughter Joan to a prince of Austria, forging a link with Central Europe to diplomatically isolate France. Edward III also paid close attention to relations with the Church and the Pope. Though a warrior, he never openly challenged the Pope as some of his predecessors had. Instead, he carefully cultivated an image as a moral monarch, protector of the English Church, yet respectful of Rome. He sought papal approval before launching short crusading campaigns against Muslim forces in the Iberian Peninsula, thereby earning favor with other Christian kingdoms. All of this made Edward III not just a skilled warlord but a true architect of a European alliance network. Under his reign, England was no longer just an island kingdom. It became a continental player, calculated into every major decision from Paris to Rome, from Edinburgh to Lisbon. Of course, not every alliance lasted. Treaties broke, marriages failed, loyalties shifted. But one thing was certain: Edward III had pulled England beyond its insular borders and placed it at the center of European history. And amid all the treaties, conquests, and negotiations with European kings, Edward III understood something better than most. No empire is built by sword alone. It must be anchored in blood, in family, because no matter how mighty a king may be, he needs a strong rear guard, a woman who stays behind the castle walls, keeping the hearth warm while he rides into war. A queen not just in title, but a keel that keeps the ship of power from drifting in storms. And he found her when he was just 14 years old. Philippa of Hainaut, a girl from the Low Countries, daughter of the Count of Hainaut and a French princess. When Edward was still a young prince, he had visited Hainaut with his mother, Isabella, during a political appeal for support, and it was there that he first met Philippa, a petite girl with chestnut hair, intelligent dark eyes, and a calmness rare among the young noblewomen of her rank. It's said that during their first banquet, Edward could not take his eyes off her, not because she dazzled, but because she was silent amid the noisy laughter, a gentleness not burdened with cleverness, but deep, like a mirror of still water under moonlight. When Edward ascended the throne, he sent envoys to Hainaut to ask for Philippa's hand. The marriage was, at first, a political alliance designed to maintain friendly ties with that strategic territory between France and the German states. But over time, it became one of the most harmonious royal marriages of the medieval period. Philippa never interfered in war or politics like her formidable mother-in-law once had. Instead, she played the role of a steadfast anchor organizing the royal court, maintaining maintaining peace within the royal household, protecting the welfare of plague-stricken regions, and most importantly, raising her children herself. And they had many children. Edward and Philippa had 13, a number impressive enough to leave even today's storytellers a bit tired from remembering names. But among them were some of the most legendary figures in English history. Their eldest son, also named Edward, was the Black Prince, one of England's most brilliant commanders, born with eyes sharp as a blade, raised amidst the scent of leather and the clang of steel. The Black Prince was trained by his father to be a warrior. He famously led England to victory at Poitiers, where the French army was crushed and their king captured. That boy, though he never wore the crown, having died young, became the embodiment of Edward III's ideal. A king must wield a sword. A prince must be willing to bleed for his people. Another son, Lionel of Antwerp, later became Duke of Clarence. His politically strategic marriage to a noblewoman of Milan extended Edward's bloodline into the Italian aristocracy, widening England's influence across southern Europe. Then came John of Gaunt, their third surviving son, founder of the House of Lancaster, which would later play a central role in the Wars of the Roses. In other words, the children of Edward III were more than heirs. They were strategic pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. Each child represented an alliance, a claim, a bridge, and a way for their parents to weave the blood of England into the very fabric of European power. But behind all the brilliance, there were quieter moments that only Edward and Philippa would understand. After long campaigns, when Edward returned to court, the first room he entered wasn't the throne room, nor the council hall, but Philippa's chamber, a quiet space lit by candlelight, scented with lavender, filled with the soft sound of her voice. They would drink honeyed wine, listen to their children play the harp, and in those moments, the man who had declared himself King of France was just a husband, a father. When Philippa fell ill and died in 1369, Edward did not ride to war for an entire year. He retreated to Windsor, avoided court, refused all calls for battle. Witnesses said he aged noticeably in just a few months. The fire in him dimmed. He stopped receiving guests. His appetite for conquest faded. It is said that for the rest of his life, Edward never again called any woman queen, though he later grew close to Alice Pereira's a sharp, intelligent young lady. Philippa remained the only one he allowed to be buried beside him. The life of a king, no matter how glorious, still seeks something simple: a warm meal, a kind wife, the sound of a child laughing in the courtyard. And in one of the most radiant chapters of England's history, one truth seems near certain: Edward III never forgot that a crown may be heavy, but a heart, without love to carry it, is easily lost. In the end, no matter how long one reigns, how many battles are won, or how many laws are written, a king is still only a man. And eventually, when the fire of conquest dims, when the children have grown, and the beloved has been laid to rest, time comes knocking. Edward III, once admired as the embodiment of power, pride, and boldness, died on the 21st of June, 1377, at Sheen Palace, aged 64. He had ruled England for 50 years, one of the longest reigns in English history, surpassed only by Queen Victoria and Elizabeth II. It's said that when Edward lay on his deathbed, the room was bathed in the faint glow of candlelight. No more war horses, no more swords and maps of conquest, only faint breath, and a single painting on the wall, the image of a young man holding a longbow, looking out to sea. Perhaps it was himself in an idealized form, forever unaged. But while Edward III passed quietly, the question of succession was far from peaceful. The rightful heir should have been the Black Prince Edward of Woodstock, the eldest son, legendary warrior, hero of Poitiers. But fate had its own cruelty. The Black Prince died before his father, in 1376. After years of illness brought on by brutal campaigning, the death of his most gifted son struck Edward III deeply and left the throne uncertain. However, the Black Prince left behind a son, Richard, only 10 years old. And so, when Edward III closed his eyes for the last time, the crown did not pass to a seasoned prince, nor to a hardened general, but to a child who had lived in castles but had never felt the chill of politics. Richard II, the kingdom sighed. A child king in times of peace might be a blessing, but in a post-plague, post-war England, surrounded by ambitious nobles, a boy with a crown was a beacon to shadows. And indeed, Richard II's reign would not carry forward his grandfather's legacy of golden glory. Instead, it would be marred by conflict, manipulation, and end in a bitter coup when his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, deposed him and claimed the throne as Henry IV, beginning the Lancastrian dynasty. But returning to the moment of Edward III's death, there was one thing that moved people deeply. They genuinely mourned him. In London, church bells tolled for 3 days and nights. In the countryside of Yorkshire, his victories were sung in mournful ballads. Monasteries hung black cloth, archers laid down their bows at stone memorials, and young boys, learning to shoot for the first time, were told, "This is the bow of King Edward's time." His body was buried at Westminster Abbey, beside his Queen Philippa, and on his tomb, there were no boasts of conquest, no lists of battles, no golden crests, only one line, "O passerby, reflect on my death, and prepare for your own." A simple reminder, even those who rule the world must return to dust. Though Richard II may not have been the ideal successor, the legacy of Edward III was undeniable. A militarily strong, politically reformed, economically awakened, and culturally ambitious England. He had taken a nation once suffocated by civil war and corruption, and turned it into a kingdom ready to speak, to fight, and to step proudly onto the European stage. And perhaps, in his final sleep, Edward smiled, knowing that while the next king might be frail, he had carved enough into the stone of history to never be forgotten, not as a statue, but as a spirit. And so, the story of Edward III, the king who reigned for half a century, who loved, who lost, who built a dynasty and watched it shift, draws to a close. From a young man who reclaimed the throne from his mother and her lover, to a warrior in armor, a political reformer, an economic builder, a brilliant commander, and a loyal husband, Edward traveled far across the meadows of England, the blood-soaked fields of France, the halls of Parliament, and finally, to the quiet bed of his last days. He wasn't perfect, no king is, but his mark was so profound that centuries later, the English still speak of him when recalling a golden age that felt almost mythical. Edward III is gone, as every king before and after. But if you listen closely, in the whisper of wind past old towers, in the distant strum of harp strings in ancient ballads, you might still feel him ride by on horseback through the mist. In Silva Amor, eyes fixed on the horizon, because a king may die, but an era does not. And now, you're lying there, maybe in a quiet room, or half watching the soft light outside your window. And as this story ends, I hope you don't just hear the echo of distant hoofbeats, but feel something warm stir inside, that within each of us, though ordinary, there are battles to fight, loved ones to hold dear, and choices that may shape a legacy. So, sleep well tonight. And if you dream of a kingdom glowing in morning fog, where a young king rides, a gentle queen waits, and their sons raise longbows toward a sky that never ends. Where history is not dusty parchment, but living stories, waiting for you to return on another night. I have many more tales to share, but tonight, let us sheath the sword, dim the lights, and let the heart drift with the whispers of the past. Good night, until we meet again.